So, good evening, and thank you for joining us for today's program, California's Environmental Heritage. My name is Vanessa Christman, and I'm your host for this event. I'm the section head of our Law and Government Publications section. But as you can see on screen, this is our first collaborative online programming venture between multiple sections of the California State Library, including our California History section, Law and Government Publications, as previously mentioned, and information services, all located in downtown Sacramento, and our fabulous Sutro Library located on the San Francisco State University campus. But this program would not be possible without the support of the California State Library Foundation, which we are eternally grateful for. To learn more about the Library Foundation and even learn about how to become a member, please visit their website at cslfdn.org. I also want to acknowledge that I work on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples, and who continue to live on this land. I acknowledge that I am a guest on their land with the hope of promoting greater awareness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights. Today's discussion is part of our ongoing effort to explore and understand the diverse narratives and Indigenous practices that have shaped California's cultural and environmental heritage. We are thrilled to have our experienced speakers, Dr. Melinda Adams, Dr. Brittani Orona, and Rose Ramirez, here with us today to share their work and their perspectives on many elements of today's topic. But to ensure this virtual presentation goes smoothly, let's first go over some housekeeping items before we move on to introductions. If you have any questions for our speakers during this presentation, please type them into the Q&A section, and we will answer them at the end of the program during our designated Q&A session. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available in the days following the program. Live transcription is enabled, so if you'd like to see captions, click on the CC icon to show subtitles. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section, and we will try to help you if we can. We've added links related to the California State Library, Dr. Orona, Dr. Adams, and Rose Ramirez into the chat window. For California State employees joining us tonight, please consider applying for a state library card, which is the best deal in state government. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get to the main event, and I'll introduce you to our speakers. First, it's Dr. Brittani Orona. She is currently a UC President and Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Santa Cruz. Her research and teaching focus is on Indigenous history and human rights, environmental studies, public humanities, and visual sovereignty. And she serves as the board secretary for Save California Salmon. Orona received her PhD in Native American Studies with a designated emphasis in human rights from the University of California, Davis, an MA in Native American Studies from UC Davis, and an MA in Public History from Sacramento State University, and her BA in History from Cal Poly Humboldt. Wow. In addition to her academic work, Orona has worked for several federal, local, and state government agencies, including California State Parks, California Department of Toxic Substances Control, California State Indian Museum, the California State Office of Historic Preservation, California State Archives, and the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Orona is Hoopa, an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe in Northern California. And I have to personally add, as a former librarian in Humboldt, they have a fantastic public library branch in Hoopa. Okay, next, we will move on to Dr. Melinda Adams. Dr. Adams belongs to the San Carlos Apache tribe. She's a researcher at UC Davis and is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Kansas. Her research focuses on the revitalization of cultural fire with tribes at the intersection of ecology, environmental science, and Native American studies. Broader implications include deploying cultural fire as a climate adaptation strategy while mitigating the frequency and intensity of wildfire in the West, which is an unbelievably fascinating and relevant topic. And next, we are thrilled to have Rose Ramirez, who is the co-director and co-producer of Saging the World, an award-winning film about white sage's popularity and its impact on the Native community and the environment. She is an artist, photographer, filmmaker, writer, California Indian basket weaver, and co-author of the Ethnobotany Project, Contemporary Uses of Native Plants of Southern California and Northern Baja California Indians. She documents and writes about Native foods, plants, people, basketry, and artists. She has a BA in American Studies from UC Santa Cruz, an MA in Public History from CSU Sacramento. Rose is of Chumash Yaqui ancestry. So now that we've introduced our exceptional panelists, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Brittani Orona.
You can get everything right in practice, but then it goes wrong in the beginning of the event. So, hey, Uncle Malia Satina Juan de Deton Onte Hoya Brittani Orona. So, my name is Brittani Orona, and thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you for the California State Library for inviting me and my other wonderful panelists to come and speak to you today. So my talk is titled Transforming Our Rivers, Settler Colonialism and Water Infrastructure in Northwestern California. I am from the Hupa Valley tribe, and I have spent most of my career, actually most of my life, thinking about how water infrastructure, thinking and witnessing how water infrastructure impacts my tribe as well as neighboring tribes of the Hupa and Yurok. And this project that I'm presenting to you today in a very brief 20-minute snippet came from the dissertation process. So I was researching the construction of water infrastructure. And if you've been following the news, you've seen that there are 4 dams that will be removed on the Klamath River that were owned by PacifiCorp, which is Warren Buffett's company. But those are being removed thanks to Native advocacy. But as I was doing research into those dams, I was noticing the revival of these dead projects in California today. So I'm thinking here in the Governor Jerry Brown administrations, Governor Newsom administrations, the Peripheral Dam in the 1940s, which is the Bay Delta tunnels as we know them now, and Sites Reservoir. So this presentation will be about these proposed but never realized dams on the Klamath River Basin. And I think it's important here to situate settler colonialism as I am thinking about it. Patrick Wolf, who is very much known as being sort of the father of settler colonialism studies, articulates this as a logic of elimination. So settler colonialism in what we live in today is not a historical event, it is a structure. And it relies on and perpetuates the erasure of Native people as a precondition for settlers to take over lands and resources from the Native population. If you do not know the history of California, I recommend We Are the Land by Damian Atkins and William Bauer. But there was a horrific genocide that occurred in Northwestern California in the region that I'm from. And from that, you see many of these industries being born on the Klamath River Basin. So hydroelectric dams being constructed, irrigation dams and diversions from the Klamath that continue today. So this talk is really about these proposed but never realized projects on the basin, as well as this proposed project that is now being realized in the Central Valley. So we'll get into it. But I want to introduce you first to the Klamath River itself. So this is a picture of Ron Reed and his sons fishing for a very large salmon, as you see But on the Klamath River Basin, we are fishing people. Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples depend on the Klamath River and its tributaries of the Shasta, Scott, Trinity River. So my tribe is on the Trinity, which is the largest tributary of the Klamath, for physical, spiritual, and cultural sustenance. So we are salmon people very much. We have Chinook coho salmon. We have Pacific lamprey, smelt, steelhead trout. Ceremonies are performed either on the water, so there's actually a dance that moves up and down the water, or near the water. So we are very much a river people. We're very much an ocean people, a water people. And from that, salmon become a very important part of who we are and our identity. So Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk elders will say, if salmon are gone, if salmon do not exist anymore, we do not. So this is how important those more than human beings are to us as Native people on the Klamath River. And to also continue to express that importance, the Hupa word for the Trinity River is as a power one should pray to, or hun. And I just really want to illustrate how important this river is to us as Hupa people. My grandfather's property is right near the Trinity River, and I grew up going there and swimming and spending time with my family. It's a very important place. As Dr. William Bauer has written, all people from the Round Valley tribes, all people have a creation story, a narrative that explains their origins, sense of place, and uniqueness. California Indian creation stories begin on the water. California Indians understood themselves as people of place. Creators made the world for a certain people and a unique people for a specific place. Languages and identities reinforce the significance of place. So again, we are water-focused people. This is our place. This is the center of our world. And each tribe in California that exists has their centers of the world, and they're often situated near water and river systems, creeks, fresh water, oceans. So I'm skipping a lot of history. Again, this is a very brief presentation, but the period of dam speculation on the Klamath River really begins with early colonization into the region in the 1850s. We on the Klamath, on the lower Klamath, so I'm talking mainly about the lower Klamath tribes of Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk, but we have often been designated as being kind of late in the colonization process. So in the 1850s, there are various waves of settlers that come into both the upper and lower basin and wage violent wars against Native people. So Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people fought in these very violent events. And so if you read Dr. Bauer's work, you'll just find that kind of information there as well. Also, Jack Norton has a really great book about this period of time, this really devastating and violent period of time, where Native people really have to resist and push back against these military campaigns against us. So after this period of colonization, when reservations are established in the Hupa Valley, and then eventually into the Yurok Reservation, dams are being constructed on both the upper and the lower basin. So between 1916 and 1958, 3 hydroelectric dams are built on the upper basin, which are these dams that are being subject to removal. And this triggers poor salmon runs on the Klamath Basin itself. And Native people and Native fishing is blamed for those poor salmon runs. So in 1933, Indian gillnet fishing is banned on the Klamath River by the state of California. In 1958, J.C. Boyle Dam is completed, and then 1964, Iron Gate is completed. Sorry, 1962. So all those dams are subject for removal. And then on the upper basin, there are federal projects that are completed, the Klamath Reclamation Project. And then on the lower in 1964, the Trinity Diversion Project, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So this is all to say that by replacing the Native population on the Klamath River, you see this really big uptick in the construction of water infrastructure on the basin in the years after the Indian Wars, quote unquote. And so these dams are constructed for irrigation, hydroelectric activities, and agricultural purposes. So the Bureau of Reclamation, there are two separate major projects in California and Oregon, one being, but mainly I'm focusing on California here, the Bureau of Reclamation Central Valley Project. So the federal Central Valley Project is primarily for irrigation purposes for agricultural water holders in the Central Valley. Water from the Trinity Diversion Project feeds into the Sacramento River. So if you are based in Sacramento and you see how big the Sacramento River is, please note that that is because it is Trinity River water. So that water is diverted from my people's region. And then Klamath Basin water is affected by continued diversions into the region. So I wanted to quote here from Paiute scholar Kristen Simmons. Our daily lives are structured around the projected expansion of these expanses of federal control of the settler state project, large-scale experimental military projects. So as an aside, she's talking about Nevada, that are multiplying or to function as a pristine state or national park, engineered to be closer to perceived state of nature as a technique of violent dispossession. So from me, I'd argue too that water infrastructure is a technique of violent dispossession, and a proposed projects marks the disappearance or forgetting of Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood to continue the violence of dispossession. So tribes weren't asked whether these projects could go forward or if they would even benefit the tribes in question that would be impacted by the diversion of these waters. Remember, the state of California had banned salmon fishing and commercial salmon fishing on the Klamath, making economy for fishing on the Klamath River Basin nearly impossible to feed into hydroelectric activities and agricultural purposes. So these are just things to remember about this history of the basin. So what I'm focusing a little bit today on is the state water projects. This is a map of proposed and actualized state water projects. If you drive down Highway 5, I believe, and you look at the aqueducts, that's the state water project. And people tend to think of that as a long-standing infrastructure, right? It's a critical infrastructure. It's noted as a critical infrastructure, but that's only been around since the 1960s. So the ways in which we have transformed California's landscape has only been around for 60 some odd years. And that's something I always like to bring up because these things aren't permanent and they're not. What I mean is, like, this history is not that long ago. So proposed projects included Apa Dam, Dos Rios, and Sites Reservoir as a part of the state water project. And the state water project functions a little bit differently than the Central Valley, and is to provide Central Valley project to provide water to Southern California. And original proposals were to transfer water to the Klamath, Eel, Mad, and Smith rivers. And salmon runs and the depletion of salmon runs, and actually a coalition of Native people, conservationists, and recreational fisher people really push back against some of these proposed projects as they're being stood up. But here I want to talk about APA as a function of dispossession. So Apa Dam is proposed in 1950 as a part of a Western Water Reconnaissance Report commissioned by the Bureau of Reclamation and taken up by the State Water Project. And the project is named Apa, which is a Yurok village site. And it would have flooded the tribal lands of Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples. So the reservation in Hupa was established in 1864, and then in 1891 expands to what is then known as the Yurok Strip. So these were already federal reserved reservation lands. And Dr. William Bauer has discussed this as being a part of, and Mike Lawson and other scholars who study damming across the United States, but have described this as a process of Indian removal. So it's a part and parcel to remove Native people from their lands by flooding them out. And actually, as I was looking at some information on Dos Rios, which is another proposed but never realized project, Dos Rios was to flood Round Valley Reservation in Covelo, which is a tribal homeland to several tribes like the Yuki, Wailaki, Concow. There was in the map, and I wish I could have put this in the presentation. In the map, there was a little note that said potential site for an Indian museum. So there is this kind of thought process that they knew that they were going to flood out these lands and impact and remove Native people from their tribal homelands. But there was very little care about that. And it feeds into this idea of settler colonialism and the logic of elimination that is happening here in the state of California. So this is in the periods after what has been defined as the historic genocide, right? 1846 to 1873. But this is an ongoing attempt to remove Native people from their homelands. So APA was one of several dozen proposed dams and reservoirs on the Klamath River and other major Northern California rivers. The uniqueness of APA is both within its name, APA, after an Yurok village, and the failure to mention any of the tribal lands that would be flooded. So in this report, there is no mention of tribes at all. There is no mention that this would impact Hupa, Yurok, and Crook people, would flood our sacred sites, would flood our villages, would flood our homes. There is absolutely no mention of that at all. But Hupa, Yurok, and Crook activism really kind of halts this project. Native people go to meetings and stop and really advocate against APA. And there are several other projects that are also proposed during this time period. So Native people keep up with what's happening with water and critical water infrastructure projects. So if you look at newsletters into the 1960s and 1970s, when Iron Gate is built in 1962, you see that Native people, Hupa, Yurok, and Crook peoples, especially Hupa and Yuroks, are saying, well, these agencies are saying that we are the ones that are depleting water, depleting salmon through our fishing. But in reality, there's these dams that are being built on the upper basin. There are dams being built on the lower basin on the Trinity that have direct correlation between the salmon runs and the depletion of the salmon runs and what is happening on the river system itself. So there's a lot of discussion within these tribal newsletters about what's happening on through critical infrastructure studies. And so I like to bring that point up because sometimes when we're talking about the Klamath, we get really into 2002, which is really important. And that's when the fish kill happened that kind of starts the removal process of these 4 dams that are now being removed. But really, Hupa, Yurok, and Crook people on the lower basin and Klamath tribes on the upper basin have always been very tuned into what is happening to the rivers because it goes back to the very beginning. We know our river system well, and we have been on those river systems since time immemorial. And so anything that happens to that river, that happens to our more than human relatives, happens to us. And so there's a long history of Native activism on the Klamath River. And that's really the point that I hope that in this very brief, I'm looking at the time, so I don't go over, but in this very brief presentation that I can offer to you, like there's actually a long history of resistance that began in 1850 and has continued to the present day. So I want to briefly end my talk on Site to Reservoir through a legacy of violence. Ann Spice writes that the government mobilizes the language of critical infrastructure to transform oil and gas infrastructures from industry projects into crucial matters of national interest. So she's coming from the positionality of oil and gas in Canada, so pipelines, But in California, we see this kind of narrative happening with critical water infrastructure. In California, the gubernatorial administrations from Governor Pat Brown to Governor Gavin Newsom use similar language of critical infrastructure to turn agricultural projects to crucial matters of state, national, and world interest. California Feeding the World plays into the narratives of water waste, conservation, and supply. The Save Our Water campaign becomes a personal endeavor where the individual is responsible for water conservation when agricultural and other industries use 40% of water in the state. So this project sites will take water from the Sacramento and put it into this new reservoir. It has been fast-tracked by the governor, actually just recently, November 2023, under SB 149, that allows 270 days to decide legal challenges filed under the California Environmental Quality Act. So many organizations, including the one I sit on the board of, have been watching this project. And Sites Reservoir was first proposed in 1950. So it's very much an Eisenhower administration project. It's an old project. And that's why I wanted to bring up these proposed but never realized projects. Dos Rios, APA, and Sites all share the same genealogy, but Sites is coming back into the fore and will continue to take water from the Trinity River, which already has precarious salmon runs and will impact the Klamath River. We are people built from world renewal. Our belief is that we must remake the world, and it is our responsibility to remake the world for not just us, but for everybody. And right now the world is severely out of balance. And so it is very much the belief that the river has to be healthy for the world to get back into balance. And so I want to end on that. And thank you for having me. And I look forward to hearing everybody else's presentation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Orona, for that engaging and informative talk. So now we're delighted to welcome our next panelist, Dr. Melinda Adams.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the very warm welcome. And Dr. Orona, thank you for that amazing presentation. So Dagote, she Melinda Adams, Honchle. Hello, my name is Melinda. I belong to the San Carlos Apache tribe. I'm a cultural fire learner, and I'm also a burner. And I'll go over what cultural fire is and how California is the epicenter of Indigenous peoples reclaiming the right to steward our lands through the use of fire stewardship. So I am at the University of Kansas currently, where I have been accepted an assistant professor position, where I get to continue the research in building fire coalitions, Indigenous people leading fire all across. So I'm excited for that. And also my, as an Indigenous person, Native person, my responsibilities to return to these places that I've built relationships with, the practitioners that I've worked with all across the state of California. So it is my responsibility to return and to hold those relationships close and to keep, to tend and to care to them. So what I have for you today is talking about the removal of fire from what is now known as California lands. I'm so happy that we heard about water because in a lot of conversations with fire management and solving fire problems, the wildfires, it tends to be that water and fire are separate. But as Indigenous peoples, many of us hold cultural stories, Indigenous ways of being that center both and put them in relation to one another. We burn purposefully to return water tables and to make better quality soils to hold on to water better. So I appreciate the connection there. What you're looking at is a cultural fire demonstration that I've had the opportunity to lead now at a very special place that I'll introduce you to, that's in the Sacramento Delta region, located in Woodland, California. So this is us placing purposeful fire back to the landscape to rejuvenate materials that Indigenous peoples use for cultural lifeways, and to also do our part in mitigating the fuel built up or the untended land that contributes to the catastrophic wildfire that we're experiencing. So I did want to thank my mentor, Dr. Beth Rose Middleton Manning, who's a professor at UC Davis in the Native American Studies Department, and also my cultural fire practitioners that I've worked with. They're not mine, but the cultural fire practitioners that I worked with to uplift this work. So I did not put it in my introduction, but in my educational journey, I did go to a tribal college in the same town that I've returned home to. It's one of 37 academic institutions that started as a boarding school, actually. So a big part in colonization and removal of Indigenous peoples from our homelands and the removal of our kinship networks that we held with each other and our more than human relatives. So a very important part of that elimination of Native and settler colonialism. So I went to a tribal college there, and now I've returned, and I have my Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science, my Master's of Science from Purdue University in Ecology and Environmental Science, and just graduated in June with my PhD from UC Davis. So wildfire is now, after experiencing this past summer, it affects all of us. It's very prevalent in California, as we all know, but this past summer, the effects of it are now being visibilized in the media and in person on the East Coast. So this summer, it seemed like there was an awakening in all parts of the United States, and that wildfire is not an issue that only happens in the West or in Canada. A lot of people are going to be affected by it, especially our most vulnerable populations, those with pre-existing health conditions, our elders, and our children. So in California, we're experiencing this rise in gigafire, and scholarship is now stating what a lot of Indigenous peoples already know, that there are roots of colonialism that has removed fire stewardship from all of our homelands that Indigenous peoples shaped and tended to and cared for millennia. So that fuel buildup is directly related to the change and shift in our landscape and compounded by the effects of climate change. So what this graph is showing us is that these wildfires are going to get more intense and are going to become more frequent if we don't problem solve or have more controlled, cultural, and prescribed burns. And there's been scholarship on this that talks about the importance of Indigenous fire stewardship in a myriad ecosystems that are home to California. So I'm thinking of the work of M. Kent Anderson, who worked very closely with many Indigenous nations. And as an ecologist, she proposed between this fire stewardship cycle, there was also Indigenous peoples. Sometimes a lot of the history is misconstrued when we talk about tree ring data, when we talk about charcoal data that points to wildfire as a primary source of why those scars exist. And it erases, in a way, the Indigenous fire stewardship that we know took place in people's homelands. So M. Kent Anderson presents this idea that Indigenous peoples had a role within these mosaics that were created, that is pyro plant diversity, so lots of different plants that are fire adapted and fire dependent. And they also played a part in shaping the preventing the encroachment of forested species into grassland species and deciduous shrub species. So signaling that, yes, Indigenous people stewarded fire for a long time. And it also speaks to the practices, of Indigenous fire and local economies that were built as such. And some of the literature, which may not nuance in a way that we would like for it to be Indigenous histories, the coalitions built or the trade routes or the interactions with different tribes across locations, fire was a part of that, water was a part of that. So really refocusing how we think about ecologies, how we rethink anthropologies. So fire gives us a lens to which to rethink that part of history, California history specifically. So I talked a little bit about this before, but to kind of give us a time scale of the colonial legacies and that what were the removal of fire from the landscape and how it is that we got to where we are with this wildfire crisis. So one of the very first pieces of state legislature in 1850 was to not only remove Indigenous fire, but to remove Indigenous peoples from their homelands. So there's one specific area where they outlawed quote unquote Indian burning. So literally taking away fire stewardship. And one of the cultural fire practitioners that I've learned from, Margot Robbins, who is executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council located in amongst the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk. She talks about how fire was outlawed for so long and wasn't until recently, 2012, where they were able to feel safe in picking fire back up and restoring those ecosystems that are fire dependent. And the way she explains is that her people are fire dependent cultures. So many Indigenous tribes relied on and had a relationship with fire stewardship. So when you take away fire violently and have consequences to that, either being jailed, being fined, it's a long colonial history of having those two be intertwined. So when you take away that fire stewardship, or really any land care stewardship responsibilities, that includes water care too, you're denying relationships and responsibilities and identities that are built off of that interaction with more than human relatives that make up places in our creation stories, our prophecy stories, and the ways that Dr. Orona shared of how the world came into being. And you're also denying this layered stewardships. It's not just fire for plants. It also encompasses access to hunting and fishing rights and gathering rights. So I'll walk through how I will walk through how basket weavers have very much led the directives in a lot of the return of cultural fire that's taken place since 2012 in this specific area. So this history coincides with different removals of Indigenous peoples, including the Dawes Act and the Indian Removal Act. Some current barriers as we're seeing settler colonialism upheld as a system and through agency. So there's still multi-layers of things that prohibit Indigenous peoples from picking fire back up. Like I said, California is at the epicenter where we're seeing a lot more Indigenous peoples maneuver around policy or to leverage policy enactments to invoke more power in reclaiming Indigenous cultural fire. But some of the barriers include public perception. We've built a national campaign and that all fire is bad fire. So trying to undo some of that inherited fire fear within policymakers, within the general public, that tends to be one of the reasons that keeps people from burning. The others is not having enough people trained in working with fire at a capacity of which the landscape needs it. So landscape wants to see this fire. We see that in fire adapted vegetation species and other wildlife that's adapted to lower temperature managed fire. And then the policy, land tenure, and regulatory frameworks that prohibit Indigenous peoples from picking fire back up. And I want to start with the complications of having federal recognition status and not having that federal recognition status. So when you have it, you're able to work collaboratively with the government to be able to have access to resources to steward lands, and that's best case scenario. But for tribes that don't have that federal recognition, they're not afforded that working relationship, that government to government relationship. And in California, there's a greater number of tribes that are unrecognized comparatively to the rest of the United States that don't have that federal recognition. And then there's also, I don't like this term, but there's also landless tribes, like literally tribes that don't have access to their own homelands. Or state or federal recognition. So the complicatedness that is settler colonialism and its impact on the environment. So I want to say it's complicated, but it's purposely built this way to be problematic, to be hard to maneuver, to be hard to navigate. Just some of the work that I do, it very much tries to place the policy part, which we've just talked about, kind of that ongoing settler colonialism in terms of the environment. Looking at ecological responses. So I look at the plant responses and the soil responses to Indigenous-led culture fire, which are lower temperature, lower severity than wildfire, lower temperature, lower severity than some of the prescribed burns that we see that are agency oriented. All of that, I tried to be grounded in Native American studies, Indigenous ways of knowing and being within scholarship to honor and acknowledge like that Indigenous identity part of the work that I do in community with Indigenous fire practitioners in California. Very quickly, there's a map of Native lands digital, which tries to do a better job at placing Indigenous people's homelands in context. So I encourage you, if you're doing work with maps, to look here first to try to map out where it is that you're working. So these are the peoples of what is now known as California, Indigenous peoples that I work specifically with in returning fire, and as a support structure, you know, this is their work that I'm amplifying, and that I have the opportunity to work in community with and for. And the work that I do, it's like I said, it's returning fire to the landscape and finding the policy maneuvers to be able to do that. Some of which California has shifted the overall agency mindset of fire suppression to being able to put good fire on the ground. And that's response to the growing number of gigafires that we're experiencing. So I very much want to say that this return of fire is in my experience, for the most part led by Indigenous women that are basket weavers, traditional gatherers that guide us in fire placement. And the special place that I work at, the Tending and Gathering Garden of the Cache Creek Nature Preserve, it was started by members of the California Indian Basket Weavers Association for the return of fire to build better plant materials to work with for basketry. And just showing how maybe different culture fire is from prescribed or agency burns. So you won't see people with hard hats and yellows and greens with a prescription. You know, we very much tried to make this family oriented the way that it had always been done prior to colonization, and returning those community roles, and that everybody had a place and a purpose in our burns and understood that relationship with fire as power, not necessarily as destructive or a negative force, but as a source of renewal, as a source of kinship. So we very much have that intergenerational and intertribal component to the good firework that we're doing. I'll try to speed it along here. So two recent passage in legislation has leveraged power back to Indigenous cultural fire practitioners to be able to see fire return to landscapes where it hasn't been present in 100 and 150 years. So I work with practitioners who are returning fire to those landscapes in that timetable. And this is, again, off of the work of advocacy from community members that led up to these legislative change. So for decades now, we have had community members, relatives, advocate hard for the return of fire, for the return of good water care, and for the stewardship of our homelands, of Native homelands. So these two pieces of legislation, they were enacted in 2022, and the peoples that I work with were able to celebrate that and invoke this cultural fire burn boss. So equating the status of a state certified burn boss with all of its credentials and all of its years working towards fire profession to a cultural burner who inherently has this knowledge that's been passed down for decades or generations. So they're able to return that fire to specific landscapes. So it feels like it's undone a little bit of what colonialism has done. Okay, so I kind of want to wrap up here. So I wanted to celebrate this new issue of Artemisia, the California Native Plant Society journal, which has been useful for Native scholarship and those that work in community and telling the stories of the ecological stewardship that they're doing. So it had a problematic name. It was Fremontia was the name of the journal. And upon 2022, learning about the editorial board, learning about the problematic person that Fremont was in Native American massacre. So they've decided to rename the journal Fremontia to Artemisia. And Artemisia is a significant plant to a lot of different tribal communities in California. So this is the first issue that will, and since it's renaming, that features all Native and Indigenous writers and researchers in that celebration of that renaming. And so I wanted to present this information that I worked with Native women fire practitioners, Diana Almendiras, she's Maidu in Wintun, and Pam Gonzalez, who is Wintun, Huchum, and Indigenous herself. So they've conceptualized Indigenous homeland history as a way of retelling California history through the Native lens. A lot of times that history is erased or displaced or invisible. So the work that they do through K through 12 and beyond, they wanted something to contextualize their perspective of fire as a lens that retells California Indian history of those places. So this is, I present to you Indigenous Homeland Histories, and that's from Pam Gonzalez. And tethered to that is Indigenous Homeland Ecology. So the stewardship lessons of native plants and waters and animals specific to homelands. So it's kind of shifting that history of a place and invoking Indigenous homeland histories, which we talk about in the article. So please check it out if you can. And then there's some more references and resources. I also wrote with the Honorable Chairman Ron Good in talking about solastalgia, environmental grief that young people in California specifically that they're experiencing, and how cultural fire has healing elements. So not just healing the landscape, but not just healing our communities, or healing our cultures when we return those land and fire stewardship responsibilities. So that piece is called Solastalgia to Solophilia. Solophilia, the love that you have for a place. So cultural fire as that solophilia. There's a QR code if you would like to see more work that we do through this cultural fire lens, but very much retelling of California Indian history, retelling of Indigenous histories to homelands, to place, and yeah, some of the eco-cultural stewardship work that I'm fortunate enough to do with communities in California and beyond. So Ashont, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams, for that amazing talk. We are excited to welcome our next panelist, Rose Ramirez. So please join me in welcoming Rose.
Hello, thank you. I want to thank the California State Library and the Library Foundation for having this event. And to the other speakers, those were really wonderful presentations, very interesting, and I'm going to definitely follow up on some of them, some of the information put out there. And of course, thank you to this crew who has put this together. I really appreciate it. So when I was asked to speak, settler colonialism isn't a term that I use or use often, and I'm in a community that uses it quite often, especially amongst younger people. And so I had to really kind of look at it and try to understand what it means. And I find that it might mean different things to different people, depending on where they're located, even to different tribes, depending on where they're located. So I had to look at it and see how it figures into the work that I've been doing for the past almost 40 years, up to my current project, which is looking at the problem with white sage. And my understanding is that colonialism, or settler colonialism, is defined as a system of oppression based on genocide and through colonization that aims to displace a population of a nation, oftentimes indigenous people, and replaces it with a new settler population. I think this is something that most of us see readily. The goal is the removal and erasure of indigenous people in order to take the land and use it by settlers. But this can include enslavement and abuse of those people. Native people in the Americas have had many forms of this colonialism. To put it in today's perspective, it is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and their culture. And I think it was said earlier, culture is who we are. We're tied to our land, we're tied to our plants and our traditions. My work over the last few decades has been around native plants, their uses and their habitat, and how they are in danger. And of course, the people who depend on them are in danger too with their loss. I'm not a botanist or an ethnographer academically, but I am more of a lay person in that respect and document what I think needs to be documented. Sometimes this means we work closer to the issue that some academics who might study people from outside than other academics who might study people more from the outside of the community. I began to interview Native people more than 30 years ago, in part to learn more about my own Native ancestry of Chumash and Yaqui. I met a cousin from the San Ynez Reservation, and she was knowledgeable about plant uses and traditional crafts and arts, most that were once utilitarian. She taught these skills to anyone who wanted to learn. This seems to always have been done. Many doctoral students would stay with her to learn, and non-native doctoral students would stay with her to learn and work on their degrees. Even though she would wholeheartedly welcome them, she was always angry to find that their work often would not even include her or mention her. And yet the next time someone came to her door, she would open the door to them and continue the process. She wanted to be seen. She wanted her knowledge to be shared. I had been interested in traditional basketry mostly, and I stayed with her for a short time and learned some basics. I learned a few of the various crafts, helped her teach these crafts when she would go and do workshops, and as well as on the reservation there. I interviewed her as well and discovered some of the real impacts of generational living on a reservation. There were a lot of sad stories, difficulties, racism outside and inside the community, and this was within her lifetime. She's been gone for probably about 15 years now. At the time, there was very little benefit to being there on the reservation, except it was inexpensive housing for many who couldn't find work easily off the reservation. She would have regular classes, but they were poorly attended. Only a few of her community knew these crafts, so it was important for them to be taught so the next generation would continue them. I always continued my basketry practicing and learning and teaching others. In fact, as a single mom attending the university and then graduate school, I did far more teaching about basketry than I did making baskets. Eventually, I met my husband, who took a real interest in the basketry and native plants, as that was part of his native ancestry too. He is Luiseño, Cupeño, and Kumeyaay, and Purepecha. Together, we started visiting the native California communities in Baja California. By then, I had been basket weaving for a few years, and I felt that basketry was one of the most symbolic elements of our culture. Gathering plants, preparing, and weaving, often in groups, mostly with women, as for Southern California tribes, it was traditionally a woman's job to make the baskets. Used for everything from gathering and cooking of foods to carrying babies, a tradition many still keep today, and in part for ceremony, which often includes ceremonies around death. Even today, baskets are an integral part of California Native communities, north and south of the border. When I first started weaving, there may have been 5 weavers that I knew of in Southern California. Any others were not being public, perhaps, or had given up the art itself for lack of interest, or the amount of work versus the money that they could get for them, because it was a great part of their economy. It's a very different story today, though. Weaving is back and a very strong part of our Native communities, with many weavers all over the nation. And SIBA, I was also a member of SIBA from the onset of that, which I believe is more than 30 years ago. So in going to Baja California, my main purpose was to connect to the California native weavers there. We would find that many artisans from the communities were struggling economically, and the selling of baskets and pottery was an important way to bring money into the home as well, and the community as a whole. We never went to the communities to visit or interview, etc., without buying from them as well. In two of the communities where many artisans could be found, the primary artisans are women. I felt that they were in a place California Native communities north of the border were about 100 years ago, where selling baskets was a major part of their economy. North of the border, it was the same until the Great Depression killed the market, and collectors could no longer afford baskets in most cases. So in Baja California, they were trying very hard to sell their baskets and pottery with limited places to do so. The few resellers who would come to the communities would take advantage of the poverty and pay very little. If the weavers couldn't sell their baskets for enough money, they would give up and leave to find work in the city, often as domestic workers. This is very similar to what happened in Southern California. A lot of weavers left the reservations to become domestic workers. They went to, as domestic workers, or sometimes went to packing houses, which is very common in Southern California, Orange County packing houses. By doing so, leaving the reservation, leaving their traditional communities, they were losing their language, their traditional cultures, their knowledge, their history, the basketry, pottery, and about the plants, traditional foods, and the medicines. This is their culture, but it was very hard to maintain once they left the reservation. We filmed, photographed, and recorded many Native people, both north of the border and south of the border, on their knowledge about plants and their lives. The plants in this region are the same, but we could see that where one group no longer used the plant because they lost the how and why for it, another group will use it and their elders might still have the knowledge. Around 2008, Deborah Small joined us. She's an academic and was very interested in our work, and I invited her to work on this project. Together, we produced a calendar for the 2010 called Edible Medicinal Material Ceremonial, Contemporary Ethnobotany of Southern California Indians. We took our images, quotes from our interviews, and wrote about 12 different plants. I was very concerned that most of the ethnobotany books being produced in recent decades were based on old ethnographic notes by J.P. Harrington and others. And by using the old information and not talking to people today, there was this view, one that I heard often, that Native people no longer used their plants or had traditional knowledge. Of course, we knew that wasn't true, and our work was a constant reminder that Native people are still here, but struggle to continue their traditions. The society at large hardly had interest in the indigenous people of the land, and the knowledge that Native people are still here is a reminder that you are an immigrant. People do not want to be reminded of that. The 2010 calendar was an example for the communities of what we wanted to do with the information we were collecting and to share it with them all. All of these communities that shared cultural traditions, language, stories, history, and many were even related. The people we have from north and south of the border in this region are often related. After a few years, we decided to make a book, and the Malki Museum from the Morongo Reservation picked it up and helped produce a bilingual edition of the Ethnobotany Project, Contemporary Uses of Native Plants by Southern California and Northern Baja California. Because this information was being sought after by most of the Native communities in the region, it was made primarily for them to help once again bring these plants and their uses back to the communities. For the larger public audience, it was to remind them that California Native people were still here and still maintaining their cultural knowledge, preserving where they could and restoring it where they needed to. I was very clear that we incorporate in the book that we were not making a recipe book for the general population, but that this was to educate about California Native people today and their continued use of their plants, and in some cases, taking back that knowledge that was once the center of their daily lives. Their foods, medicines, and even the understandings of the relationship with their plants, whom many tribes view as relatives and ancestors, and are an integral part of their origin stories. In 2018, in working with Barbara Drake, a Tongva elder, on plant use and helping her gather and prepare foods, she voiced her concern over expanding development at the Etowanda Preserve in Rancho Cucamonga. The preserve had been established in the 1990s to mitigate the development of the 210 freeway near the 15 interchange. In this preserve was the last remaining large stand of white sage or sage scrub habitat, where the keystone species was white sage, Salvia apiana. We said we'd look into it for her, and what we found was not that they were going to develop part of the preserve, but that the preserve was being poached of the white sage. This information crushed her. Barbara's motto was always, "We do not sell our medicines. If you need it, we will give it to you." It was devastating for her to learn that not only were people stealing the white sage, but it was satisfying a worldwide demand for it. White sage only grows in Southern California from just north of Los Angeles, or just north of Santa Barbara, down to northern Baja California. It is a very small growing range. We found that there was a grower in Jacumba who was growing white sage organically. We went to visit the farm and met the wonderful Ken and Ellen. Ellen is a tie-dye artist and would wild gather sage to sell at her tables. And it was selling so well, and so many others were doing the same, that she knew this was not sustainable. So her and Ken began to grow it, probably about 20 years ago. Looking further into the poaching, we found that it was these botanical shops, trade shops, and the health and wellness market that was selling not only smudge sticks from poached sage, but also they were selling California native culture by offering abalone shells, Indian chants and prayers, feathers, along with many other poached plants like Palo Santo. For decades, Californians have complained about the cultural appropriation. California tribes have complained about the cultural appropriation of their ceremonies and other cultural traditions. It always fell on deaf ears. We found that the poaching of a preserve, no less, had taken probably more than 20,000 pounds in an estimated 8 years. And only based on when they caught the poachers, that number is only based on what they actually caught. It could be multiplied by a factor of 2 or 3, maybe more. We then found more stories from other preserves in the Southern California area that they would catch poachers all the time, always for white sage. And Baja is the same. Tribes there who don't have quote unquote reservations would always have trucks taking out many kinds of plants, white sage, juniper, jojoba, they would just take it. The tribes had no power to really stop them. Even on private property, it was not spared. The white sage was not spared. One person told us of 3 times her fence had been run over by a truck, where the people would quickly get out and fill their large trash cans with entire plants that were pulled out of the ground. Their call to the police went nowhere, as they didn't think that taking weeds was a concern for them. We contacted agencies such as the Forest Service to see what records they had of poaching of sage, and they said that was not a concern for them, as they were looking for pot growers. This was a few years ago, before it was legal. I can tell you that today they know what we're talking about, and they are much more interested. In the beginning of our research, we were approached by United Plant Savers, who are a wonderful worldwide organization who try to watch and protect medicinal plants around the world, as many are being poached. They had been looking at the selling of white sage and could see that it was a plant of serious concern. We were approached by Kimon Degree from South Africa, who was going to write an article about white sage poaching and had already published a book about the poaching of abalone in South Africa. He could see that the two were connected, abalone being poached for the meat, as well as the white sage kits for New Age shops, where cultural appropriation is at its height, and also where concerns and awareness seems to not only be lacking, but intentionally ignored. In one of our first talks to the public, we had an amazing crowd, but sadly, many of the people who came thought we were going to tell them how to use white sage. They were sorely disappointed. Afterwards, in a Q&A, a woman asked me, well, what was she supposed to use? Now, mind you, this woman is of European descent. I was taken aback a bit, and I pretty much said, use something else. But I have since asked people to look into their own ancestral culture, what plants were used and what methods of ceremony or prayer, and try to get back to that. As one of our Tongva elders said, if it is not your culture and you are not using it to pray, and you are using it to pray or for speaking to your ancestors, then you're speaking to the wrong ancestors. After articles and interviews, we finally produced a film on the white sage issue called Saging the World. It premiered in April of last year. It has been through the film festivals. We have screened it perhaps 100 times, most in person with an audience and sometimes panels and Q&A. Yet when I look at the internet, I see not only more vendors and more influencers selling the sage and the culture, I also see posts not only about using white sage, but how to grow it. And that is positive when we do find people who are trying to discourage the use or to buy sage that they have no idea where it is sourced. But it is still an uphill battle. We still have film and television portraying white sage. This is a big part of why it is so difficult. The stereotype continues to be perpetuated. They perpetuate the use of white sage as a ghost remover or spiritual cleanser. This is not traditionally a big part of how white sage is used in the Southern California white sage region. This is an embedded stereotype. And it's really a stereotype that we find is all over the world. People are using it to remove ghosts and for spiritual cleansing in almost every country on earth. So to buy it on the internet and don't even ask where it comes from, it is just Native American as far as they might know. Of course, it only grows in Southern California. So it is an ancestral plant, the relative of the indigenous people of this region, and nowhere else in the world. It is a medicine, it is a blessing plant. It is used for funerals and for menopause. It is one of the many sacred plants that grow here. But the co-opting of this plant by non-native people brought it to the brink of extinction. The cultural appropriation and the thirst for quick fixes to personal problems has contributed to the disaster of disappearing animals and insects through the poaching, climate change, and constant development of sage scrub habitat, where so many of the native species depend and white sage lives. In the white sage region, we have lost upwards of 70% of our sage scrub habitat. And with that goes all the birds and the insects and other plants and animals that depend on it. Even the nasty advent of HOAs, and I know a lot of people live in HOAs, but in the region we have so damaged our environment. A contemporary colonialism is what I see. That all you can afford a home, if you can afford a home, are you being trapped into it? Because you can buy here an $800,000 house, but you can't paint it the color you want. You can't plant a native plant garden. You can't even grow tomatoes. You're forced to have a green lawn, even though we live under constant water issues. You can be fined for having a native plant garden or tomato plants. Do you really own this home? Or is it a high-end trailer park? That's my constant pet peeve. But you certainly can't take this house with you. And then there's those HOA fees that keep going up. And in some cases, they name these places tamarisk estates. And that's one of our most invasive and damaging plants here in Southern California. Or they call it oak heaven. But there are no oaks, or the oaks are European because they're shorter and preferred. So it doesn't really help us environmentally. So if I was to try to understand colonial settlerism from a contemporary view, it seems that people who moved from one place to another and then want to dominate it, complain about the weather and everything is a weed, and then they bring their plants and their foods and they don't recognize the impact of what they're doing, only that it is what they want, so they will have it. And even you may not fit into their ideal of what that all should look like. Like many places, Southern California is a critical biome. We have so many medicinal plants here. We don't even know yet all that they can offer for human health. But with every new development, we could be destroying a cure. Certainly they are destroying our climate. As Native people from this region know, these plants have kept us alive for countless generations. For thousands of years, we learned how to harvest, use, and care for these plants. They have a relationship with us and have cared for us for all this time, and we need to do the same. We need to plant native plants in our homes. We need our community gardens to be filled with native plants, our parks, along our streets, freeways, and highways. They need us to know, as we always have needed and will continue to need them. Without our native plants, what culture do we have? What culture do we have? The dominant colonial culture that simply is not survivable. But with the education and bringing awareness, the majority of people will learn and begin to understand and come around, I hope, cross my fingers. It takes a lot of work to reverse a very bad course, and that has done a lot of damage. But now that we are in the midst of climate change, we can still do something, and it begins with us in our homes, yards, and communities. This last image here is my son and granddaughter planting yet another white sage in my yard. And all the plants you can see in that image are native plants. I have about an acre and a half, and predominantly it is native plants, but I still have my roses and my fruit trees and other plants that I love. But I know to help the environment, I have to have native plants. I have to provide habitat for the species, because I have 5 neighbors that share a fence with me, and not one of them has one native plant that I can see in their yard, not even an oak. So that is my talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rose. That was a fascinating and inspiring talk. So we are going to also, I wanted to thank our speakers for their engaging and thought-provoking talks as well. We'll open it up for questions now. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, please enter them into the Q&A section. If you have questions for a specific speaker, please note that your submitted question is either for Dr. Adams, Dr. Orona, or Rose Ramirez. So I think I am going to be passing this to my colleague, Maddie, who has been monitoring the questions.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, and thank you again to our speakers. Steve, Elisa, and I have been very busy. We've got about 15 minutes to answer some questions. The first one comes for Dr. Orona. Dr. Arona, what have your studies revealed about the cultural and environmental knock-on effects of dams and the reduced salmon runs?
So I'm not quite sure what knock-on means. I'm looking it up now so I can answer.
Sure.
Secondary, indirect, or cumulative effects of let me look at the question, sorry. So there's been a lot of effects for Native people in Hoopa, Yurok, and Crook territories, as well as Klamath tribes, and any tribe that's really impacted by the loss of water and salmon runs. And the Klamath River is not the only place that experiences this. But we see a lot of, so there have been many like news articles in 2016. I believe the New York Times ran article about the negative effects of dams on Native youth. So you see a lot of depression, suicide. So there was a rash of suicides that happened in 2016 in Yurok territories. And not being able to have the ability to do what we have always done since time immemorial, which is fish. We're fishing people, we're a fisher tribe. We're fisher tribes. Like we really depend on that kind of relationship. And it really surrounded everything that we did and still do in our homelands. And so you see those negative effects really affecting youth. Like this is anecdotal, but my grandfather, he was born in 1929, and he remembered fishing with his father when he was a kid and remembered watching the river die, essentially, because the dams were being constructed in his lifetime. The last major dams on the Klamath and Trinity rivers were in 1962, 1964. So there are people within their lifetimes that remembered that and remembered when the river was teeming with salmon and that people could go to their fishing spots and do that. And this intergenerational knowledge passes down to us. Like I've never seen the river healthy in my life ever. Like it's always been toxic algae blooms, low water, warm water. And that severely affects you as a Native person to know what it could be and to see the effects of settler colonialism and to watch it in real time to people in your communities, families, friends. Like these aren't abstract thoughts. Like it's not a thing that I study. I was born into it. So it's very difficult to watch your culture die in front of you. But that's why there has been this intergenerational fight. Like youth start and then they grow old, and some people start young and grow old and they don't see that river return. With the dam removals, I think there is hope that that river will return, but it's deeply personal and it really affects people on the basin. But there's a lot of hope, I think, with the dam removals happening now.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much. Our next question is for Dr. Adams. To what extent have people from state agencies been open to cultural burning, especially as wildfires become more and more extreme?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I would say I'll start with we have a lot of good people that we build collaborations and partnerships with. At the recent California Indian Day in September, there was, the proclamation from Governor Gavin Newsom that shared news of more infrastructure for wildfire resilience and climate resiliency grants that tribes are taking advantage of. I think there was upwards of 14 tribes that applied for and have been successful in obtaining these CAL FIRE specific grants. So the shift in overall agency mentality around embracing putting fire to the ground and moving away or keeping duties of fire suppression and having more of a balance in a system that for so long was guided by fire suppression, all fires out. So that was just recently this past fall. So the agency support has shifted, but I will say there is still some people that are in higher positions of power that make decisions based off of their inherited knowledges of fire is bad, or fire is fearful within agency, not just fire agency, but water infrastructure, a DOI. So it varies from person to person. So it's important when we do this work to have those collaborations that are people specific, unfortunately. But that's usually helps in streamlining some of the protocols and permissions that are needed to have fire reintroduced to a place. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is for Rose. Rose, how can we best redirect appropriation to respect one's own as well as for others' cultural heritage? How do we encourage respect for biodiversity and ecology as opposed to simply trying to purchase a better life?
I'm not really sure I understand. Can you repeat that?
Sure. How can we best redirect appropriation to respect for one's own as well as others' cultural heritage? How do we encourage respect for biodiversity and ecology as opposed to simply trying to purchase a better life?
Well, on the redirect, I think it would be important for all of us to recognize when there is cultural appropriation, not just, California tribes, but we have cultural appropriation everywhere. And I think people need to take it upon themselves to reject it. Don't buy into it, question it. I don't think I can answer the entire question there, but I know one of the things we ask people to do to help us on this issue, to help us with the white sage, is that when they see it for sale, because it's in your Whole Foods, it's in Cost Plus, it's in markets, and it's just everywhere, that they be asked, the seller be asked where it comes from. And if they cannot tell you exactly where it is sourced in a way that you can actually contact that farm and find out if they are growing it, if it exists, if they can't do that, then you can't buy it. If you buy it, you're most likely getting poached sage, because at least 95% of what is out there is poached, and it's a very unhealthy product. It is not gathered in any traditional way. It's often musty and mildew and has insects, and it's just a very unhealthy thing for people to do. And if this type of burning a plant is a part of a spiritual ceremony that one has, as far as the culture here goes, when a plant is not cared for and respected, when it is pulled out of the ground and permission is not asked, it's not positive energy. And a lot of the people who are using it talk about positive energy. They're trying to get positive energy from this. Well, poached sage would give you the worst type of negative energy that I can imagine if you sow and believe in those things.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Believe it or not, we have like 5 minutes left, and I have a question for all three speakers. What are some ways you see how each of your topics actually interact with or lift up each other's topic?
Well, I know I could say that the issue of burning is a very important issue down here, and I think they're starting to get to where they can burn. We have a serious problem with the sudden oak death with our oaks, and we have some other insect problems. And I think burning, having not been able to maintain burning, is one of the reasons those things are taking over. I think that's very important. And certainly rivers, clean rivers, healthy rivers are essential to the lives of the tribes as well as the rest of the population. You can't separate yourself from nature. You can't.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna have you wrap up, Dr. Rona, if that's okay.
No, you go.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think I touched on it earlier, the importance of culturally native peoples. We don't separate fire from water from plants. So this really beautiful nexus that have brought us all together for this talk uplifts the work of our communities and those advocacy steps forward that have been taken for decades now. So that's kind of where I'll leave that. Thank you.
Yeah, to everything that Rose and Melinda said. It's absolutely interconnected. And I think one of the hardest things about doing talks like this is that we can't really get into the really interconnected nature of like protecting plants and how that interacts with water, cultural fire and how that interacts with water. I'm always thinking about water, but you know, smoke cools down water and it helps salmon get to where they need to go. Water is needed to grow our basketry plants, and the basketry plants that go along the river are medicinal plants that are along the rivers and creeks. I mean, they're all so holistic and interconnected. And yeah, I've learned so much from Rose and Melinda, and I really do appreciate being here. And I hope that you all take that from this talk, how really interconnected these issues are through like this settler colonial lens too. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic back over to Vanessa. We obviously have a lot more questions that did not get answered in this session, but it's my hope that we can send you follow-up emails when the recording is ready, and then maybe we can send out the email addresses for the speakers at that time. So that's something to look forward to. Vanessa?
All right. Well, thank you again to our panelists, and thanks to Maddie and Lisa for navigating the Q&A, all the robust and fantastic questions we got from the audience today. And thanks to our panelists. I can't say thank you enough. This was such a wonderful experience. And thank you to our attendees for attending this evening's programs. I wanted to a quick plug for the State Library. If you're ever in the area, please visit the State Library in person in Sacramento near the state capitol, or our Sutro Library section in San Francisco on the San Francisco State campus. Thank you all for attending and have a fantastic evening.